So I guess we can start. Welcome very much to this webinar today, and thank you for joining. We think that today's webinar is going to be a very interesting and important webinar, since you may know that shipping, and especially sea shipping, contributes about 2 to 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And in our estimation at this stage, it is likely that PtX fuels are one of the crucial ways how we can achieve more climate neutral shipping in the future. You may know that today's webinar is only the start of a 3-webinar series where we will talk about different aspects of how to green shipping globally. This series is organized by 3 organizations: the International PtX Hub, implemented by GIZ, Agora Verkehrswende, and PtX Lab Lausitz. And today we will start by talking about developing green shipping corridors. And the next webinars will be looking at maritime climate mitigation options, technologies, and fuels. This webinar will happen on the 2nd of August 2023, and we will have a 3rd and final webinar on climate change and shipping, international ambitions and regulations, where we'll talk about what are the different aspects and what organizations really want to achieve, on the 10th of August 2023 at 1 p.m. Central European Summertime. Later this year, we hope to publish an online training on green shipping and PtX. Today, we will hear from my colleague Frank Munk, who's an advisor at the PtX, have a short introduction into the topic before we come to our main speakers. Jesse Farnestock will talk about strategies and business models for developing green shipping corridors, and Vanessa Davidson will talk about the development of the South Africa-European Union Iron Ore Corridor Initiative. Each of the presentations will be followed by a short Q&A session, and you find already in the line below your screen the specific Q&A window where you can enter your questions during the presentations, so we can start looking at them and cluster them so we can ask them directly to the speakers. Before we start, I would like to also mention a few housekeeping things. So please turn off your microphones during the presentations. It's also not necessary to leave your camera on. If you have any questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function and not necessarily the chat, because otherwise we'll have 2 channels at the same time. This webinar is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, switch off your camera and your microphone and you'll be out of the recording. If you have any technical problems, you can reach out to us via the chat, and after this webinar, we'll make the slides available, so don't worry about that. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Frank, who will give us a short introduction into the topic. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the kind introduction. Let me quickly share my screen. Yeah, it's my pleasure to give you now a quick introduction into the topic of green shipping to frame our today's webinar series on green shipping corridors. Before I go into the contents, let me give you a very quick introduction into what the PtX International Hub actually is. The PtX Hub is based in Berlin, is mandated by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and is implemented by GIZ. We are a center of expertise and collaboration, aiming at accelerating the defossilization of energy sectors globally, with a specific focus on hard-to-abate energy sectors such as transport and industry. As such, the International PtX Hub advises governmental decision makers around the globe on green hydrogen and Power-to-X applications, with the aim to drive and to support sustainable development and just energy transition for all. We do have networks and links to many stakeholders in different countries. We have specific know-how in hard-to-abate sectors and around the process of transitioning energy sectors from fossil to renewables. Typical activities we conduct are studies, advisory services, trainings, knowledge exchange formats, international networks and cooperation formats, and so on. On the map on this slide, you can see where our current activities lie. In each of the countries, we have a team of consultants present, and we do conduct activities and advisory services for institutions in those countries. What are we exactly doing around green shipping at the moment? One of the points is we're currently developing a deep dive training on green shipping that will actually be launched in the Transport and Climate Change Week in September, organized by GIZ. And the training will then be step-by-step released to the public, be available for the public also most probably as an e-learning by the end of this year. Furthermore, we are currently conducting several studies on green shipping ports, looking a little bit at what are infrastructural requirements, what kinds of skills need to be developed with regard to green shipping specifically, and what can be the socio-economic potentials, benefits of green shipping ports in partner countries. Another major activity we have is the development, together with local partners, of a power-to-liquid pilot plant in Morocco that is aiming to demonstrate the production of e-kerosene and e-diesel in compliance with the international norms. This is going to be implemented starting from next year, and we think to have the plant operational 2 to 3 years later. More on, what we are planning to do furthermore is to look deeper at book and claim systems for green shipping fuels, and the topic of today, green shipping corridors. This webinar is just the starting point of this topic for us. So now I'm actually jumping into the presentation on green shipping. Before doing so, a quick look at the definition. What do we mean by green shipping, actually? What we mean is to defossilize maritime transport. That means that a transport that does not use fossil fuels anymore, and actually where the carbon emissions are at net zero. This is why we call it defossilized maritime transport and not decarbonized, because it's still possible to use carbon in future fuel systems if these carbon sources are sustainable. But what is important is that we get rid of the fossil-based carbon sources. Okay, what you can see here briefly in this graph is actually the urgent need we have to go to green shipping solutions. Since you can see, and Michael mentioned in the beginning, that we're currently having a 3% contribution of global shipping transport to our greenhouse gas emissions. That's at a steady state of around 800 million tons CO2 per year. And since the trade volumes are going to rise, according to all projections, until 2050 by 30% roundabout, you could see that if we're going at a steady, if you're going at a business as usual scenario, would then actually raise greenhouse gas emissions tremendously until 2050. On the other hand side, if you want to align with the Paris Agreement, what we need to do is to get to net zero as quickly as possible. The International Maritime Organization did consider this urgency in their latest negotiations just some weeks ago. The initial target of the IMO was to get 50% reduction on greenhouse gas emissions until 2050. Now they have actually doubled the ambition, means going to net zero until 2050. The green line below. So this is ambitious. The EU as well has done a major step this year. The EU has decided that actually all maritime emissions within EU ports will be included in the emission trade system by 2024, and even 50% of emissions between EU ports and international ports will then be accounted in the emission trade system, which will help to make alternative fuels more economic. We will hear more on these international regulations in our third webinar series. Now the question would be, with this ambitious targets, how do we actually reach it? How can we defossilize maritime transport? This would be the second slide. And as you can see, the statement would be that PtX fuels will actually be the main pillar of this defossilization actions. There are several alternatives, such as listed on the left-hand side, but you will see that those will not be sufficient. Efficiency measures are always important and welcomed, such as route optimizations, using wind sails, or further increasing the efficiency of engines. But in the end, what we have seen in the past also is that those measures don't suffice to reduce emissions, since we always are on a economic growth path. That means we will produce more, we will transport more, and then even though we reach higher efficiency levels, we will not reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is called the rebound effect. On the other hand side, electrification of maritime transport is possible only to a limited extent, primarily on short distance routes. And if there are no major breakthroughs in battery technologies, this will still be the case in the coming years and decades. Biofuels are at the moment playing a limited role and will in the future, but this cannot be increased much more, since the biomass itself is limited and has also competing use cases, for biogas for heating as an example, or the whole nutrition chain. So today, all the projections say that PtX fuels will be the major option to defossilize maritime transport. They are the only scalable option available today, and the only climate neutral option as well for long distance maritime transport. So the projections say at least 50% of all transport volumes will be powered by PtX fuels in 2050. You can see the figures, what this translates to in numbers on the right-hand side here per continent, and also an equivalent of tons of fuel oil, which is pretty considerable. So yeah, we've only talked about PtX. PtX is just the name of all fuels produced from renewable energy synthetically, but there are a lot of options. There are different synthetic gases that can be produced from renewable energy, such as e-methane, e-ammonia, and of course hydrogen itself. And there are different liquid forms, such as e-methanol and diesel. And the next slides will be, maybe in its details, a little bit hard to grasp. We will not go into the details of all that. It will be covered actually in our second webinar on technologies, on PtX fuels. But the message I would like to convey here is there are a lot of options in the room right now. You can see here on the upper hand of the slide, all the options, and each of it has individual advantages and disadvantages on the technical side. So today it's not yet clear which option will prevail for maritime transport, and that makes it also a tricky case. And this is actually where the green shipping corridors come into place, because at the moment we have this chicken egg problem. No competing fuel types, no one knows exactly which fuel will be predominant. At the same time, a lack of PtX fuel production capacities and adequate or relevant bunkering infrastructure. So as long as this is the case, the ship owners will have a hard time to decide, okay, we'll switch our fleet to this and that PtX fuel. And unless the ship owners don't take the decision, it will be hard for the fuel producers to set up a major production facilities. So this is more or less the problematic situation. And green shipping corridors can actually overcome that problem, because they can bring together all the relevant stakeholders in the process, the energy suppliers, the ship owners, the ports, and the authorities, to agree on specific rules and standards for defined shipping route to get the process of green fuels and green shipping started. Another beneficial aspect of PtX fuels is that the fuels for shipping can actually be produced, sold, and bunkered locally without the need to be transported around the globe. That gives ports and those also the first movers along green shipping corridors the opportunity for additional trade shares and for additional business opportunities by producing the fuels adjacent to their ports, and then by selling them to the ships on the way. At the same time, it's a growth opportunity for countries themselves that have large resources for solar and wind when they are one of the first movers on green shipping corridors. So it's an opportunity, but of course it's also challenging, and we will now hear more on the practical side of setting up green shipping corridors in the next presentations. With that, I will hand over on back to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you for outlining the broad issue again, and also like making such a nice transition already to green shipping corridors. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Jesse Farnestark from the Global Maritime Forum. There's a special thanks going to Jesse because he only chipped in this morning for his colleague to join us today. And I'm very glad to have you here. Jesse has been working for WWF on the energy transition, and he's also been the head of energy and policy foresight at RISE before. And I'm very glad that you're here with us today. The floor is yours. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Make sure that I can get my screen sharing activated here.
We see your screen. Thank you.
That's good. Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. As was said, I'm Jesse Farnestark. I'm with the Global Maritime Forum, and maybe I can say a few words about the Global Maritime Forum for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're an international not-for-profit organization. We're based in Copenhagen, but we work with the global shipping industry and indeed with the entire maritime ecosystem. We're a not-for-profit and a mission-driven organization. So we work to basically improve the impact that the shipping sector has on the world, socially, economically, environmentally. We do so by working closely together with industry and close stakeholders of the industry, thought leaders, international organizations, NGOs, who have a deep involvement with maritime issues. We work together to identify issues and generate and facilitate collaboration projects. The GMF is supported by industry partners, so we do have partners who support us financially. But as I said, we're a mission-driven organization, and we work in support of the mission and not in our partners' interests. We've been working on maritime green corridors for 2.5 years now, roughly. And as Frank said, we'll start to move towards the more practical considerations. But despite the excellent context that was already provided there, I wanted to give a little background to explain how we tend to think about the role of green corridors in shipping's decarbonization. I think one important bit of context, both for shipping's decarbonization and for the way that the Global Maritime Forum works, is this sort of loop between ambition, action, and policy, right? We see that there's the potential for elevating the ambition for what can and should be achieved, to spur action from industry leaders who are motivated to move early, and for that to be supported by policy action. And we see quite a bit happening in all three domains. The progress from the 2017 status quo, where shipping decarbonization was almost completely off the agenda, to the developments in the last few weeks, where the International Maritime Organization has basically adopted a strategy for full decarbonization by 2050, shows that there's been a huge change in a short amount of time. Much of that having to do with raising ambition from within the sector through, for example, the call to action on full shipping decarbonization that 240 industry leaders signed in 2022. Sorry, 2021, time is flying. Also from the initiative taken by cargo owners who have committed to decarbonizing the shipping of their goods by 2040 already, by organizations like the Science Based Targets initiatives who are now producing guidance for corporates in the sector to align with the Paris-aligned trajectories, but also action taken by the industry. We've been documenting innovation projects, so pilots and demonstrations in this space for 4 years now. Our latest report actually has 373 pilot and demonstration projects documented from around the world. Green corridors, which is today's topic, from going from a relatively new concept a year and a half ago until the signing of the Clydebank Declaration, to there being 20 plus green corridor initiatives launched last year, a few more launched this year so far. The Cargo Owners Ambition Initiative has evolved into an actual buyers alliance where cargo buyers have come together and say, we commit to buying space on zero emission vessels. And the shipping sector itself has begun to order its first zero emission vessels. And of course, this has all been supported by policy. The Clydebank Declaration on Green Corridors sent a very powerful signal about the importance of these initiatives. The EU took the incredibly important step of regulating not just regional maritime activity, but international shipping under its Fit for 55 package. And of course, now the developments at the IMO's MEPC 80 meeting 2 weeks ago, where the new strategy was adopted, targeting full decarbonization with meaningful reductions in 2030 and 2040, as well as an ambitious goal on the uptake of PtX fuels by 2030. Of course, that will need to be followed by actual policy measures, but the process has been laid out for doing so. So we see this self-reinforcing loop of ambition, action, and policy. And what is this loop trying to deliver? Well, it's trying to deliver a very ambitious transition trajectory. If you think about the adoption of zero emission fuels from essentially zero today to 100% by 2050, the only way you're likely to get there is through a kind of S-curve shaped development. This is actually the way most new technologies are emerge when they're starting from zero, like we are in shipping today. So these have been studied a lot, and the different phases of these transitions are well understood. But I would say that the steepness of this curve between 2030 and 2040 is really remarkable. There's going to be a massive transition of the sector during that decade. And that means, while not every company will be able to order zero emission ships tomorrow, everyone needs to be getting ready now in some way. So in terms of how transitions work, well, typically this is getting a bit academic, but I think it's worth talking about because it really frames the way we think about green corridors. There are 3 phases. You have this emergence phase where the new technologies are tested and developed and learning is shared. Once the technologies and business models associated with them are mature, there tends to be a rapid diffusion phase. Now, if you're talking about a technology like cell phones or flat screen TVs, this diffusion phase tends to happen because you reach a price point that means they're cheaper than the previous alternative, or the new technology is so much better and more attractive that it tends to roll out quickly through the market. In our world of decarbonizing shipping, this diffusion phase is going to have to be significantly driven by policy at the global level. Luckily, we now have a strong signal that such a policy will be in place. But of course, once the market-based rollout has reached most of the globe, you will need policies to ensure that it reaches everywhere, that no countries are left behind, and the entire sector is changed, and there's no going back to fossil fuels, essentially. But the important thing is for this discussion is where green corridors fit into this. And I really want to highlight this now. The green corridors are about this first phase. We see green corridors as the arenas in which this coordinated development, testing, and at-scale deployment of zero-emission shipping will take place and should take place. That means that green corridors are not just shipping decarbonization by another name, which I fear is sort of what's happening in the debate around the green corridors, that people talk about them and all they mean is just decarbonized shipping. I think that's a mistake. green corridors should put themselves out of business, right? Green corridors should be in the business of bringing these new technologies to maturity so that once they are at maturity, green corridors can become irrelevant because zero emission fuels are available everywhere and zero emission vessels are the default technology being ordered. And that needs to start happening by 2030. So green corridors are about the period between now and 2030 and getting these technologies to maturity. We've tried to underscore this by defining a green corridor as a shipping route on which the techno-economic and regulatory feasibility of zero-emission shipping is catalyzed through dedicated actions by both the public sector and the private sector. So Frank mentioned that you may have specific regulations. I would argue that you also ought to have specific incentives on these routes in order to make them realizable, which I'll get back to later. But you also need dedicated private sector action. So companies need to come together and develop new joint initiatives, joint ventures, demand pooling activities, focused on these routes in order to take advantage of the favorable conditions that they have. And that's the other thing to highlight here, that green corridors are not for every bit of shipping all over the world. They should really try and take advantage of the routes where the conditions are favorable. There are different ways to assess how favorable the conditions are on a given route, and I'll come back to that later. But it probably would be a mistake to try and deploy green corridors always and everywhere. Instead, they should be focused on the place where there are advantages to early action on decarb. When we look at green corridors, we tend to look at 4 building blocks. The first one almost goes without saying. You need the full value chain engaged in some way to develop a green corridor. The second one is very important, though. You need to determine a fuel pathway. A green corridor that is leaving the fuel pathway undetermined is probably not doing much good because, as was pointed out, one of the fundamental challenges for shipping decarbonization is uncertainty around which fuel will be the right choice. So a green corridor really needs to pick a fuel or a subset of fuels and focus on developing the infrastructure for those if it wants to get the coordinated action that's necessary. That doesn't mean that what a green corridor picks needs to be the dominant fuel for all of global shipping. It's very possible that there will be a mix of fuels in the future. But if we want to overcome this chicken and egg problem, we need to have green corridors developing specific fuel pathways. And one of the criteria to look at then is to look at routes where there is a particularly logical fuel to focus on for one reason or another. Green corridors also need the demand side. It's easy to focus on the infrastructure and the vessels, but there needs to be sufficient demand to help cover some of the cost of the new fuels as they're deployed on these routes. So there are different ways to get demand involved depending on the segment of shipping, but it's important to have demand side actors, the cargo owners, the charterers of vessels involved in these initiatives. And then, of course, there needs to be action in the policy and regulatory sphere, which I'll come back to later. We have, besides spending some time thinking about the concept of green corridors and what needs to go into it, we've also in parallel tried to track what's happening around the world and monitor progress. In November last year at COP, we published a progress report on the first year of green corridors. We'll publish another one this year. And over the course of the sort of first year after the launch of the Clyde Bank Declaration, we saw 20, we say 20 plus because there were 2 initiatives that we knew about that weren't confirmed at the time of this report. 20 plus initiatives launched in that year. There have been several more significant ones this year. A mix of short sea and deep sea, which we think is totally appropriate, actually. A pretty broad range of stakeholders, more than 100 companies covering the whole value chain. A range of different targets. Most of these had not been set as of last year. And then different roles taken in terms of leadership. A really strong presence from the ports, and this has been super encouraging. Ports, of course, cannot invest in the vessels and oftentimes won't even invest in the fuel production, but they have a great facilitating role in terms of bringing the value chain together. But a number of public-private initiatives where governments have been involved too, which has been very promising. Here's the same information in map form. I would like to point out that this map was published before the launch of the South Africa to Europe iron ore corridor that Vanessa will talk. I'll say a few words about it. Vanessa will talk about later. So there should be a line headed up Africa's west coast as well. And there have been a couple other initiatives launched since then as well. As you can see, quite a bit of concentration in Northern Europe, maybe unsurprisingly, but also in Oceania, the Asia, Australasia Pacific region. As of the end of 2022, most of these initiatives were in very early stages, either just working through their initial partnership design or pursuing a pre-feasibility analysis. Some had moved on to a route-specific feasibility assessment, and a few had begun to, had published or finished an implementation plan for the corridor. None were particularly near any deployments, and I think it's important to be realistic that these green corridors, while they're arenas for early action, they do not deliver solutions overnight. They are an accelerated pathway to decarbonization may involve some of these vessels being on the water 2025, 2026, 2027, but not this year and probably not next year. Some more information about the mix of stakeholders, not to dwell on this too much, but I would just call attention to the fact that the fuel choice was TBD in 40% of these initiatives last year, which we saw as an issue. We think it's very important that a fuel or multiple fuels are chosen for these initiatives. A good mix across segments, and while only one bulk corridor was included this time last year, there are 3 more that we can add to that list now. So it's been quite a good spread across the different segments of shipping. How far have we come with respect to these building blocks? How are the design of these initiatives looking? Well, we see a lot of emphasis on knowledge development and exchange, actually a real enthusiasm for exchanging information between the corridors, which is terrific. Pretty good on surprising amount of action from the policy side as well, although with a few important gaps. The demand side was underrepresented in the first year of corridor initiative development, and we think that that's a problem that needs to be addressed. So there weren't enough cargo owners or charters directly involved in these initiatives. National governments have also been acting, so we've interviewed essentially all of the Clydebank signatory governments, or about 90% of them. A number of them are providing some sort of public funding, whether that's just to support feasibility or pre-feasibility studies, or to support specific asset development. Many of them are doing stakeholder convenings themselves, trying to encourage the industry to take up the mantle and develop these corridors. A number of them have begun to assess the routes coming out of their countries. We've been involved in some of those country level assessments, and we think they've been quite productive. And many of them have begun to develop MOUs or other arrangements with their co-signatories, the Clydebank Declaration. Now, those tend to be quite soft agreements, frankly, but they are potentially a platform for more meaningful bilateral policy action. What do we need to see from national governments? Well, I think what we really need to see is that national governments accept they have a role in closing the cost gap. These power tax fuels today cost significantly more than conventional fuels. They probably will for the foreseeable future. There is an element of first movers on the demand side being willing to pay a green premium to cover some of that cost gap. But there's going to be a need to cover the remainder as well. Things like a carbon price could potentially help make the zero emission green corridors more competitive. If they're going in and out of Europe, for example, where there will be a carbon price applied from next year. But there's probably going to be a gray zone in the middle. Here we filled that with, for example, a contract for difference support payment, some kind of subsidy mechanism that would allow these first mover vessels to cover a significant portion of the extra costs for zero emission fuels. We don't believe that many of these corridors will actually get to implementation if there isn't some kind of mechanism like this put in place. So in terms of developing these corridors, we have some general recommendations and then some process steps that we'd like to share. We do think that if we want to have speed and impact, you need to involve key stakeholders, especially the cargo owners and fuel producers, the sort of further from maritime actors need to be involved early. We believe, once again, that national governments are going to have to take a role in supporting the cost of the fuel. We think there's room to be more critical when prioritizing green corridors. There have been a lot of green corridors launched, and we are not certain that All the thinking has been on the most impactful and feasible first mover routes. And I think there are ways to think more clearly about that. And we want to emphasize once again that a specific fuel pathway or fuel pathways are necessary to provide clarity for the industry. One thing I'd like to add is once again that green corridors are about a technology transition and the journey to 2030. They're about getting to the tipping point. And one of the challenges we see is that it's very tempting and understandable to focus on reducing emissions. But green corridors that focus on reducing emissions may end up delivering emissions reductions instead of zero emission fuels and technologies, right? There are some options. There are drop-in fuels, there are efficiency measures that can be taken. And optimizing for the wrong variable, so to speak, is a bit of a risk here. So we are encouraging corridor initiatives to really think about the technology transition. In terms of activating corridors in practice, which is something we've had a little bit of experience in doing, we think it's important to start with the assessment of options, assessing routes either at a national level or out of a given port. And in parallel with that, engaging some key stakeholders, seeing where the interest lies. Once the priority routes are identified and the stakeholders are involved, feasibility studies play an important role in fleshing out the actions that are needed. In parallel with these feasibility studies, which may be done in a sort of narrow consortium of a few companies looking at the feasibility for their own investments and assets, you might want to have the development of a broader program. We see a role for what you might call route mapping in the maritime sense, or road mapping in a technology study sense, where you really outline the necessary steps for the whole development of the corridor. We think this is the kind of thing that can help coordinate actions that are necessarily disconnected because they're owned by different stakeholders or they're taking part in different joint ventures. An overall roadmap for the development of a corridor, we think is quite a useful tool. When we're talking about getting started and assessing the routes, one of the things we've done is work with our partners at the University College London and University Maritime Advisory Services to develop a quantification tool that actually can look at the different options for developing green corridors or first mover routes and quantify the stable amount of zero emission fuel demand likely on those routes. So looking at clusters of regular demand from vessels that trade regularly between destinations and where their fuel demand is clustered and whether that could support the development of fuel production. So this is a tool we've developed primarily with governments in mind, thinking that this could be something for governments to sort through to help them prioritize their policy actions. And we're actually in the process of testing. We're testing this with the government this afternoon after this meeting, and we're looking for other governments who are really interested in this prioritization tool. It could be interesting for ports and other industry actors as well, of course, but we think it's particularly relevant to governments. We also think that it's important to have a stakeholder input dimension into assessing different routes. So as an example, when we published our report, The Next Wave in 2021, looking at green corridors as a global, from a global perspective and tried to identify priority routes, we consulted with a number of stakeholders. We did some quantitative and qualitative analysis and tried to prioritize high impact and high feasibility routes. And this is how we ended up developing an initiative on the shipping of iron ore out of Australia to East Asia. It's also what had an impact on the development of the Singapore-Rotterdam green corridor that's since been launched, as that was identified as a high impact and reasonably high feasibility option. With the Australia iron ore shipping, one of the other factors that was, some of the other factors that were really favorable were the potential availability of low-cost zero-emission fuel, likely to be ammonia, because there are projects underway in very good renewable energy conditions, and the willingness of stakeholders and interest in stakeholders throughout the value chain. So we've engaged some of those stakeholders. A small group produced a feasibility study. So 2 mining companies and 2 shipping companies together produced a feasibility study that we were the project leads on, assessing whether green corridor could power assessing whether green ammonia could power this corridor, looking at the feasibility of deploying vessels and powering those vessels with clean ammonia, primarily focused on the period between now and 2030, when we assessed that it was feasible to have 23 ammonia-powered vessels operating on this route, given that certain risks were handled and that safety, for example, did not become an issue that obstructed the development. And of course, we have now moved on, or now we're still working on the Australia project. We've also developed a project again on iron ore shipping out of South Africa to Europe, engaged a slightly larger consortium, and including our friends at Saldanha Bay, who are going to speak next. So I won't get too much into this effort, but the idea is, again, to elaborate a concept and look at especially some of the business models that would be needed to ship iron ore on this route. This is particularly interesting because this is unlike the Australia work. Here we have the mining company and the steel company that's the off-taker of the iron ore involved. So you have a chance to look at different business models for the shipping. And we think that makes this a particularly interesting project. We also have, of course, the rest of the value chain involved as well. That's all I'll share today. That was quite a fast tour through some of our Green Corridor work. I'm happy to take any questions now, but also to have follow-up discussions. Anybody, this is my colleague Marika's email, but she or I can both take the conversations on any of these topics. So we'd be happy to discuss any of this with you later, and I'll leave the rest of the story on the South Africa effort to Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Jesse. It was a very interesting presentation. I have not received any questions so far in the Q&A tool. So participants, audience, you have now the chance to put in your question immediately or raise your hand if there is any questions. Meanwhile, I would be interested if you could maybe tell us a bit more about how you did the assessment of different fuel options. I mean, you said like there is like this choice for ammonia on certain routes, but what are the considerations behind that also from the side of the ships essentially? Why do you choose ammonia and not hydrogen or e-diesel?
I'm surprised at the alternatives you just named.
It was random.
So I would say, generally speaking, because we're working on deep sea shipping, hydrogen is not particularly interesting. The costs of containment and compression are probably too high unless the technology changes. Right now, the feeling from the industry is that a higher density fuel is more economic and practical. So hydrogen for these routes, these longer distance routes with larger vessels, hasn't generally been on the table. I have to say, neither has e-diesel in any of the conversations we've had, and my layperson's understanding is that there is an expectation that the costs will be comparatively quite high, and of course it also faces the need to secure sustainable carbon atom. So the question has generally been between methanol and ammonia for these corridors, and for the places where we've chosen to focus on ammonia, there tend to be a couple of different factors. One is the absence of a likely biogenic source of carbon tends to limit the potential to do a methanol-powered corridor. So actually, by not having the option of doing methanol, you have an easier choice of focus, right? So coming out of Australia, where there's a very limited supply of biogenic carbon, it didn't make a lot of sense to look at methanol. In parallel with that, of course, where you have that situation, you tend to have projects already developing on ammonia. So there's quite a bit of ammonia production in the pipeline in Australia, so it allowed us to focus on that there quite reasonably without a whole lot of further analysis. There's a potential for, a large future supply of ammonia, not just for local use, but for global distribution as an energy carrier coming out of Australia. So that was the main thing, and I think the flip side has also been a consideration. We are involved in some corridors where methanol is likely to be the priority. In one case, it's from the vessel owner's perspective, because it's cruise, right? So cruise isn't particularly interested in ammonia as a fuel because of smell and hazard issues. And so methanol will likely be a priority there. But also in places where you have, in Northern Europe, for example, where there's quite a bit of interest in methanol production and some early projects underway, those are quite likely to be deploying methanol as a priority option. Again, it's really about what's happening on the energy side as much as anything else.
Thank you very much. So I have two questions here right now. So the first question I'd like to ask, because it relates somehow, is ammonia really realistic in terms of the nitrogen oxide it produced? It was a question from Harmeling.
So I assume you're referring to NOx emissions. My understanding in talking with the engine manufacturers is that reducing NOx emissions to currently regulated levels will be not a challenge at all from the engine technology side. That's actually the various they're not scrubbers. What are they called? Sorry, I'm not a chemist, but the catalytic converters are quite capable of doing this, and the integration of them into the engine technology is not going to be a challenge. Another question, in case this is what you meant, is laughing gas, is N2O, that could potentially be a byproduct of ammonia combustion. That's not as harmful locally, but it could be quite harmful as a greenhouse gas because it has such a high global warming potential. We've seen very recently some promising information released from two different studies looking at the amount of N2O released from lab-based combustion of ammonia in a marine engine, and that the levels have been small enough that my back of the envelope calculation was that you were still getting a 97% reduction in emissions versus fossil fuels. So that's very promising. Because frankly, I wasn't sure about that one. It's nice to see the information coming out of the industry.
Excellent, thank you so much. And the other question I have here from Anne Wasicke-Scholling, sorry if I mispronounce your name, is that she'd like to know how deep you look into ports as multi-fuel hubs and also potential synergies with other forms of transport, such as trucks and of course industries.
So in the projects where we've been taking the lead, they've been that hasn't been a major focus. That may change with our friends in Saldanha, who have very much that part of their strategy. So I'll let Vanessa talk about that. But I know that, for example, in the LA-Shanghai corridor, there's a big focus on integrating with the land side, and particularly with port operations, but also connections beyond. And it's a priority for a lot of the cargo owners who want to know not just that the maritime leg is green, but that there are going to be good options for further transportation. It's not something that we've worked a lot on ourselves. So a good question.
All right. Thank you so much for being here with us today and presenting. And with this, I would like to hand over to Vanessa. Vanessa Davison works since 18 years already in marine transport, and she's a project manager at Freeport Saldanha. And she's also the chair of the International Marine Certification Institute, which is probably very helpful when you talk about new fuels. And she's today going to talk about the development of the South Africa EU Iron Ore Corridor Initiative. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Vanessa. I already see your screen. Thank you.
Great. Super. Thank you very much. And lovely to have this opportunity. So I think following on quite smoothly from Jesse's introduction is that the study on South Africa as the fueling future of shipping was done in 2021, and then the shipping energy transition in 2022. And then our corridor consortium was announced just three months ago. So very much in the yellow part of Jesse's slide in terms of inception. The consortium is made up of these 7 companies. So the GMF obviously as the lead coordinator for the consortium, and then ourselves as Freeport Saldanha being one of 11 special economic zones in South Africa. Then there is Vuka Marine, which is a South African bulk shipping company, which is also partnership with K-Line in Japan. Anglo-American, which needs no introduction, as a mining company, and Tata Steel in steel production. And then there's Engie and CMB, who are also part of the consortium. So I think it brings together a diverse but very complementary group of partners. For those of you who don't know where Saldanha Bay is, we're approximately 60 nautical miles northwest of Cape Town. And this is a slide which shows you the Freeport Saldanha footprint, which is divided into 3 different areas. The first is the northern precinct on the right, highlighted in green. Now, this is land that is owned by Freeport Saldanha and is earmarked for manufacturing. Our specific mandate as a special economic zone is on maritime and energy. The southern precinct, what we call the port precinct, is land that we will lease from Transnet National Ports Authority.
Vanessa,
and then we also have earmarked.
Vanessa, sorry to interrupt. I think we're still seeing the first slide on our screens. Okay. But you are probably already a bit more advanced, right? So
yes. Has it moved now to the consortium slide?
It has not.
Okay, let me stop sharing and reshare. Sorry about that.
So we now see your first slide.
Okay. Just get it into, take it to. Is it in presentation mode or not?
It is not, unfortunately.
Okay. Stop again. Sorry, will you just bear with me? I want to close a few things and open them again.
Otherwise, if you'd like Julia to share the slides, that could also be an option if it's easier.
My apologies. Just let me try a couple more things here. Okay, it's open there. Sorry, I know the clock is ticking here. Right, let's try this.
I can see your screen.
Okay. Okay. Has it progressed to the second slide?
It has not. But maybe you can also, I mean, if you don't use the presentation mode, I think you might be using 2 screens, right? So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's showing on the screen. Michiel, could you maybe just share the slide deck on your side, or Julia?
I can do it.
Thank you.
Just a moment. So. Oh, is it the right slide?
Yes, that's the second slide. Thank you, Julia. So this is where I was talking about the different consortium partners. If you could just go on to the next one.
No.
I think one back.
That one?
There's one in between.
Oh, okay.
The location of Saldanha, the map.
Yeah, I can.
I'm glad I'm not the only one having the technical challenge.
Oh, no, now we can see it.
Okay,
Is that the right one?
But anyway, let me just speak to the slide that we've jumped. It's just to say that Freeport Saldanha is a 3D Schedule 3D state-owned company owned by the Western Cape government, and we were designated in 2019 as a customs controlled area, which allows us to exercise certain tax and VAT incentives and reduced corporate tax. In terms of our footprint, we have 180 hectares of leasable land, which can be a challenge when one looks at green hydrogen production. And the other thing I wanted to mention in the previous slide is that we have earmarked land for an innovation campus that we foresee the R&D and innovation support that's going to be needed in the green hydrogen space. So to the slide that you see now, which says from pit to port, am I right, Julia? No, to the pit to port, the previous one? Yes, okay, thank you. So basically our objective is to assess the potential of this green corridor. As I said earlier to Jesse's point about being in inception phase, but Anglo has a railway line from Sishen and Kolomela in the Northwest Province down to Saldanha Bay. And some of the key points that we're looking at, I think it was to Frank's or Jesse's point about cross-industry collaboration and the need for the sustainable supply chain. So is it going to be possible from mining source in the Northern Cape to look at green operations? Is it possible to green the rail to Saldanha? Is it possible to green the port operations? And then obviously the green bunkers. And then, you know, developing those green ships to the fuel of choice as what that will be. And also looking at the environmental priorities on that route development work and balancing that with the commercial imperative behind it. In terms of the production of the green fuels, this is where Freeport Saldanha plays a critical role in terms of our investor pipeline of green hydrogen production. We have a number of investors at various stages. And in the next slide, I'll talk to some of the building blocks of that production. And then lastly, to the entire green hydrogen value chain, from the renewables, the electrolyzers, the pipelines, the plants, the localization of components. You know, South Africa's endowed with rare earth minerals, potentially also input into this. Next slide, please, Julia. Okay, so just to some of these key building blocks that make sense for Saldanha Bay is that we've got significant feasible land within what we call our West Coast district. We also have good renewable load factors with a wind load factor of 40% and solar of 21%. I've spoken to some of the benefits of being a free port in a special economic zone. So we are designated by the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition to play a catalytic role in industrial development. We also have the existing port and the railway lines in terms of infrastructure. Although when one looks to green bunkering, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done there. And we have easy access to Cape Town and access to a skilled workforce. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a very busy dive, but I think what I wanted to show here is our response to green hydrogen sector development. And, you know, we play a catalytic role in investment, and we support our investors in that journey. But at the same time, we also recognize that our public sector partnerships are absolutely vital. And we play a facilitation role between government, public entities and industry. And we're doing quite a lot of work in that space. In terms of investment promotion, it's working with FDIs and others to kind of promote Freeport in the investment proposition and help with external research that's underway. Currently, there's a World Bank study being done into green shipping fuels. I'll share a slide on that later. Some of the PtX studies. There's also our Western Cape investment promotion unit called WestGrow. It's currently developing a strategic roadmap. So we work with, in terms of that investment, we work with project developers to get to financial close, and then with project, we work with project developers on their investment journey. In terms of infrastructure and environment, whilst we realize projects will have their own infrastructure development, there also is shared infrastructure that we need to look towards. We've said they investigate and agitate for shared infrastructure. And I think to Jesse's point, the planning needs to be based on data, and that we play a supportive role in that space. We see research development and innovation and skills development as critical. We have an entire unit that works on skills development and enterprise development. And then in terms of the market and finance and incentives, we're looking at funds to deepen our regional master plan and support trade initiatives. So the catalytic support that we offer is to put those building blocks in place for hydrogen, to look at land access, to look at port and rail, utilities, infrastructure. Just to also mention, Saldanha is not currently a bunkering port. So we would be, perhaps it's a good thing, starting from a clean slate in terms of the bunker production, storage, and loading. Next slide, please. Okay, this is really how Saldanha has positioned itself as the green hydrogen cluster. On the right-hand side are the green hydrogen markets that we foresee. Green iron and steel very much located in the fact that ArcelorMittal have mothballed steel plant in very close proximity to us in Saldanha Bay. And they announced an MOU with Sasol to restart green steel production, DRI. But there are also other markets that exist in terms of mobility and exports, logistics, and manufacturing. So the potential for refueling demand, bulk carriers account for 77% of ships that stop in Saldanha Bay. As I said, there's no pipeline delivered bunkers available. At the moment, fuel oils would all come in by truck and then by barge to any ships that needed bunkers. I think critically, we're the largest deep port in the Southern Hemisphere. At the far end of our existing port infrastructure, we have a draft of 23 meters. Our local municipality has an environmental authorization for a desalination plant. And we have high potential, as I've mentioned, for solar and wind. I also want to mention the bottom two parts of the slide is that we have the green shipping corridor, but we also see a mobility corridor between the Northern Cape and the Western Cape. And to this end, at the Green Hydrogen Summit last year, the premiers of the Northern Cape and the Western Cape signed an MOU. And that is based around the development in the Northern Cape area called Boegoeberg-Sabai, which is a greenfields port rail and green hydrogen development. And we're actually expecting new announcements regarding that project later this week. I think 2 days' time has been the indication. But we also recognize Namibia's developments in the green hydrogen space, and that ultimately we almost develop a Western SADC, South African Development Corridor for green hydrogen. Next slide, please. Okay, I think Jesse made the point that the public sector involvement is critical, and this just gives you a timeline of public sector traction in South Africa. So from February 2021, when we had our green hydrogen roadmap published, through to the end of the year last year, when the green hydrogen strategic infrastructure projects were gazetted. That was quite a critical development. Next slide, please. The Boegoebaai Regional Master Plan was launched in March. We're anticipating the KfW announcement on the top 6 hydrogen projects that will qualify for grants. So I should have amended that. It's actually going to be this month. Transnet, which is part of the overseeing body of Transnet National Ports Authority, have a green hydrogen strategy in progress. Western Cape Government has one, as I mentioned, with West Grove. And TNPA's announcement of an RFQ for the Boegoebaai development, we expect to hear of soon. And we have local port development framework plans, which were released 2 months ago. And in the wording, there's the inclusion of alternative energy storage. So we trust that that does take consideration for green hydrogen. Next slide, please. So just a sort of more technical dive in to the preliminary report from the World Bank study. So this shows you the existing port infrastructure, and it was looking at potential berth developments. And option 1 is for what we call the general maintenance quayside, which is on concession from Transnet National Ports Authority to an entity called Saldeco, who run the facility. They're not operational yet, but should be soon. And that has a depth of 8.5 meters, just awaiting sign-off from the harbour master at the moment. The second option, this is PRDW that did the work, the coastal engineering firm, was to utilize berth 104. This would require what we call a Section 79, which is a ministerial directive, with the Strategic Fuel Fund. It would also, there are LNG pipelines planned, but at this stage, as a pilot project, we don't have sufficient project size to warrant the use of berth 104. But it will be common user, and it would have the potential to accommodate larger exports or if needed. So at the moment, option 1 is the preferred one. And I think that is the last slide. Julia, if we could just progress. I took this one out. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. Great. And those are my details, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I thought it was a very interesting presentation, and I think now we see how much hands-on work there is actually to implement a green shipping corridor. Again, if you have questions, dear audience, please feel free to post them in the Q&A module. Meanwhile, I wondered how your relation with the renewable energy providers actually works, Vanessa. Do you have any companies or any providers that will provide these wind or solar, this green energy essentially to you already, or how's your relation with that? Do you unmute?
A range of investors in our pipeline. Most of them are focused on, there are renewables as well as green hydrogen developers. And there are different stages. What we would do initially is establish a relationship, establish the land requirements, the water requirements, and the parameters of the project. And then we would set up regular meetings generally on a monthly basis to progress the project, recognizing that some are at pre-feasibility stage, others getting closer to feasibility. So we walk that journey with the investors. We have an ease of doing business unit that also assists to smooth the journey. We know that environmental permitting and various other aspects of getting the projects operational really need support. So we provide quite a strong linkage role into the various players that are going to enable that person to get to production stage.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Frank?
Yeah, I have a question actually that refers to a statement of Jesse in the previous presentation, but the question goes to both of you, also Vanessa. So you said, Jesse, that actually doesn't make sense to set up green shipping corridors at any given route, but especially governments need to choose wisely which corridors to support. So maybe you could summarize what would be the top 3, let's say, prerequisites to be in place that identify a feasible route, or what are the top 3 success factors in order to establish a green shipping corridor from your both perspectives?
Would you mind if I shared my screen? Actually, to answer that question, there was a slide in our appendix that I didn't show that answers that question specifically. So this is when we do our sort of qualitative work with stakeholders to try and identify priority routes. These are the metrics we look at. So obviously, it being of significant scale is going to be important to generating the demand necessary to justify the production of the bunker-ready fuel. The potential to reduce emissions is obviously meaningful. The availability and cost of potential supply, if you're in a place where getting a hydrogen-based fuel is going to be very, very challenging, wherever that might be. No good renewable resources. For example, if you think of our route from Australia to Japan, supplying the fuel on the Japanese side would be very challenging. Luckily, on the Australian side, it's very promising. The type of cargo is very interesting. The relative price increase to the cargo. So if it's a high value add cargo, it's likely to be affected less on a relative basis than a low value add commodity. That said, certain very strategic commodities, like dare I say iron, can in any case be a really interesting cargo. Other route characteristics is a broad topic, but I would say regularity of traffic is the primary interest. So how many different ports are vessels calling at, and how regularly are they calling at a given bunkering port? You don't want to have vessels that are moving in and out and off the route that might need to bunker other places serving the route. Age of the fleet could be interesting because it gives an older fleet gives an opportunity to turn over and invest in new vessels. And then the sort of soft factors of potential policy environment and stakeholder interest, which actually are the most important factors, frankly, but they're harder to quantify. But these are the ones we look at.
Cool.
Nice. Do you have any additions?
No, I think Jesse has very eloquently covered that.
All right, thank you. So we have one more question from Mr. Goba, I assume.
Yes, hello, everyone. Actually, a follow-up question, because I think it was also an issue where I would like to hear a little bit more on this topic, because I'm also thinking that green corridors are a good idea, but actually, why do we need the corridors? Can we not just promote, green harbors? Would it not be enough, in the sense of then letting the ships go whatever they need? Do we need really a route from one harbor to another? And maybe to be a little bit more specific on that, is this linked also to the way of how the fuels are being bought, some issues regarding long-term contracts, that you, on a route, you would expect some customers that would always use it, and in that way it would be easier to establish demand for fuels based on some contractual relations that are more long-term and allow new fuels to kick up. So in this direction, if you could elaborate a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think your first question is a very, very subtle question, actually. And I agree with you that a green corridor does not need to be a point-to-point corridor. And in fact, the project that we're undertaking with Salana Bay doesn't have a partner port on the other end, right? So that is actually a route in the sense that the goods are going out of the same port all the time, but they're hitting a couple of different destinations in Northern Europe. Because you can service the round trip with one bunkering, you don't need another port. For longer journeys where you might need bunkering on both ends, then it makes sense to have two ports involved so that anybody servicing that trade will be able to fuel on both ends, right? So for LA, Shanghai, when they established that project, it seemed likely that they might need to be able to bunker on both ends. Although actually the latest analysis suggests they might not. But you could see for these very long Singapore, Rotterdam, etc., that having bunkering on both ends would make sense. But it's not necessary. I very much agree with you, actually. And it's more important to think about the fuel and the cargo than it is to think about matching some ports, right? You need to be able to supply regular fuel to cargo owners who are going to want it. And those are the biggest economic considerations. And on your second question, sorry, I've already now misplaced your second question.
No, I think it was, or you already answered, I think, both. In the sense, I was a little bit speculating, what could be behind routes. Maybe if the advantage would be that there are some companies that would, customers having long-term.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a good hypothesis that we hope turns out to be true. the actual reaction from the shipping industry is very cold towards signing long-term offtake contracts. They would prefer to keep their current way of doing business. I think probably deep down inside they know that there's going to need to be adjustments, and it's basically a negotiation. But getting this fuel production built will require some long-term security. I think it's important to think about the role of the financiers as well, right? So it's not just the ship owners, but the banks who lend to them are going to want to see long-term access to this fuel, because it's a huge risk to invest in an ammonia-powered ship if you don't know you're going to be able to get the ammonia, right? So I think that there will be pressure from both sides to make this work. How the actual design of the offtake is still remains to be seen. There have been only a very few deals signed, and most of them involve actual direct investment from the shipping company into the fuel production. So I think that we'll see how commercial arrangements end up. It's an interesting question.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Could you add from a port's perspective, because I think it is really interesting to hear also from your side, like how you see that aspect.
Yeah, I think I can't speak on behalf of the port, but the incentive of the commercial opportunity is, I think, where I see the corridor as opposed to the harbour. Our ports authority is still in fairly early stages of planning, and the commercial opportunity of the harbour as opposed to the shipping of product. That still, I think, needs quite a lot of unpacking in South Africa, to be honest, and it will take us quite some time. But when you've got the commercial imperative of this corridor with Anglo and Tata Steel, I think it starts to make the case stronger for a corridor versus a harbour.
Great, thank you very much. Is there any other questions? It doesn't look like. All right. So let me start by thanking.
Sorry, there's another question in the Q&A module. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it actually.
Okay.
So there's a question from Raul Batero, which is, don't you consider important prioritize some environmental corridors like touristic routes to the Antarctic that should be especially protected, not only for CO2? So I think the question is about environmental protection on the corridors, right?
Yes.
maybe you could, explain your question a bit further.
The idea is that Antarctic is a pristine zone of the world, and we think it's important to protect the ship that use fuels like diesel that produce contamination in this special part of the world. So I think it's important to prioritize these fuels in these specific corridors, for example. This is my point.
Thank you for the clarification. Jesse, well, do you want to start on this?
I looked like Vanessa might have had a comment specifically. I'm not familiar with the routes to Antarctica. Maybe you are, given where you live.
I'm not familiar with environmental corridors, but Raoul, I agree with you that in terms of Cape Town being a gateway to Antarctica, that potentially looking at greening vessels that are going to Antarctica for research or for tourism purposes, it would be something important to look at. We haven't, I think it's hard to write things like this into policy and to make it obligatory. I do wear another hat, which is running an organization called Blue Cape, where we work with the city of Cape Town, and we recognize the potential for Cape Town as a gateway to Antarctica. So I really take your point, and perhaps I could take it back to the city of Cape Town and the V&A Waterfront, who are partners with us on that project, as something for consideration. I know that under discussion at the moment is a possible twinning with a South American city to look at procuring everything for Antarctica from the Southern Hemisphere. So that's something under development. I have answered this in a very roundabout way. Jesse, I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
I just wanted to note that I made a reference to a cruise corridor earlier, and that is a corridor between Seattle and Alaska in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the reasons those, so many of the municipalities with port calls on that route are participating in the initiative. And one of the main reasons they participate is because they see that potential, not just environmentally, but in terms of the interest in the paying customer to have that route green, right? Because it is a precious environment, and the reason they're going there is to enjoy the natural environment. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And I know also that some of the most advanced efforts on hydrogen-powered shipping using fuel cells have been in the Norwegian fjords for cruise vessels as well. So I think that the logic you're suggesting is something that the cruise industry has also come upon, and I think leisure travel, tourism has a different set of challenges and different set of expectations, right? And they may need to take a higher carry a higher burden, as you say. And of course, it's also important that those vessels, if you're greening them, you're greening them, as you say, not just for CO2, but they don't produce local pollutants either.
Thanks. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your questions. So I think now we don't have any further questions. I'd like to thank the speakers in this webinar, Vanessa, Jesse, and Frank, for joining us today. I think it was a great start in our webinar series on essentially making shipping more carbon neutral, or actually making it carbon neutral. In the next webinars, we'll go into, as I said in the beginning, we'll look at, first of all, the technologies and the fuels. So really like the technicalities, how to defossilize shipping, and that will be on the 2nd of August. And then we'll look again at the overall grand picture on climate change in shipping and the international ambitions and regulations. And I'm sure most of you heard that, for example, the IMO have released their new goals quite recently. So we'll look at that at the 10th of August 2023. Until then, we say thank you for joining today, and we'll be right back with the slides after this meeting, and we'll send you also some reminders to join us for the next times. Thank you very much.